Now, it is now a great pleasure to introduce this morning's worship leader, our own Shane Matheson Dietrich. Shane is a trans, non-binary, neurodivergent writer, comedian, and musician. Formerly a publisher, producer, and game designer, Shane is taking his first steps toward UU ministry. This is his first time leading a service. Welcome, welcome, Shane.
Thank you so much. We are here to face the truth about ourselves, about this faith we love, and the ways it presently serves others and the world, as well as to open ourselves to ways it can better and more joyfully reflect our potential and core values. We want to know the ways we are bound to one another, as well as to larger religious movements normally beyond our sight and vision. We say we are open and diverse, yet it is too easy to feel stuck in old paths and stubborn habits reflecting not so much tradition as our comfort. We want to answer the call to service, to a world that needs our message, our hope, our revived energy. We are gathered to learn, to unlearn, to hear, and to move forward. Amen.
The chalice will now be lit in the sanctuary. If you have your own chalice, please light it now too, and let us know that you have done so by typing in the chat at the bottom of your screen. This morning's chalice lighting words, "Could we talk about it?" are by Ann Barker. Could we talk about the dissonance between what we teach our children and how we live our lives? Could we talk about sharing and how we don't? Could we talk about the ways that privilege binds us to suffering? The ways that suffering starves us of freedom? The ways that freedom isn't freedom and never was? Could we talk about love? Please join me now for our unison affirmation. The words will be printed on your screen. Inspired by love, our mission is to seek our true nature, connect deeply and openly, and act for justice. And now we will be singing hymn number Joys and Sorrows.
Today's words for meditation come from Ashan Crawley. Ashan. Harm happens. We harm one another. Many think this is a value statement and a moral judgment. So instead of thinking about this fact, we pretend we can be innocent. And so too, we value innocence as a moral and ethical good. But my garden keeps teaching me. My intent to grow more green beans was neither good nor bad, but it appears I've planted too many in too small a space. So though many are blooming, lots of leaves are dying off, and some of the plants too. I have to remove the felled leaves daily. It doesn't matter that my intent was to grow more food. It might actually have been a noble desire. It certainly wasn't bad or mean or evil. But the impact is that the growth has still been harmful for some of the plants. What would a claim of innocence? I didn't mean to do it. This isn't my fault. Maybe I can just keep watering and hoping and wishing, even mean for the plants. The garden shows me again that some concepts, some ideas are deeply insufficient for trying to contend with our world. All that matters is my attempt to repair the harm done. So instead of guilt and shame, which are the underside of and produced by desires for innocence, care, tenderness, handling things, literally putting my hands in the dirt, getting messy with my hands. And from this can emerge repair. From this can emerge joy. And from this can be sent life and love. Amen. Bloom. I invite you to join us for a minute of silent meditation. My dear fellow travelers, thank you so much for journeying with me this morning. If you're moved by this sermon, I'm posting a few links to some additional reading materials in the chat. Know that whatever challenges you face here today, you do not face them alone. You are not alone. You are safe, and you are loved, and you are held. Let us sit together in that feeling. The feeling that whatever challenges we are about to face, we face them together. I invite you to take a deep breath all the way to the top of your lungs and let it out. Now, I'd like to start with a video clip from one of my favorite essayists, Big Joel. He's got pretty unique style, so I hope that you won't be expecting anything too conventional.
To start off, this is the most common way the story of Adam and Eve is told, the way that's particularly popular among Christian readers. First, God created Adam, and then soon after that, created Eve to keep this king company. He told Adam that he could eat from any tree in the Garden of Eden except for one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which he commanded them not to eat from. But then, a little while later, a serpent came over to Eve and was like, "Don't even worry about it. That fruit's super good. Go ahead, Eve. Eat from the tree. It'll be okay. Don't even think about it's not a problem. Listen to me. Eve, Eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So she ate from it and got her husband to eat from it. And when God found out about their disobedience, he got super mad, punished the couple, and forced them out of Eden. Forced them to feel pain, to die, to have trouble finding food to eat, etc. Now, this video is certainly not meant to make people question their faith or whatever, but I do want to push back on one of the most basic elements of this interpretation. Its claim that this story is about God punishing Adam and Eve for acting against his wishes. It's a reading that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and that's for a few major reasons. For one, pay attention to what God actually says to Adam about the apple of the knowledge of good and evil. And yes, by the way, I know that it's not technically an apple, but I'm extremely mercenary and will be calling it an apple here because it's easy and fun to draw. So this is what the Bible says. And the Lord commanded the man, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die." So looking at this, sure, what God does here is referred to as a command, but it doesn't seem like the kind of command that you'd punish someone for breaking. Imagine a father telling his daughter, "You can do a lot of things in this house, but you can't touch fire. If you do, you'll certainly be burnt." Now, yes, the father here is prohibiting fire poking. He doesn't want his kid to do it, but it's more like a warning than a command, right? And if the kid does touch the flame, it doesn't seem likely that the dad would punish her over it. After all, she was already burnt, and that was the main outcome he was trying to avoid in the first place. This is how I read God here, as an entity that is warning Adam, telling him that he shouldn't eat the apple because doing so will harm him, cause him to surely die. And when Adam does eat the apple, well, he does eventually die. In the same way that getting burnt is a consequence of touching fire, dying and hurting is a consequence of eating the apple. But there's another, maybe more important point here. So it's unclear exactly what this apple does to the people who eat it. But if we take the name of the fruit even slightly literally, you'd think that the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil would, make people aware of good and evil. Therefore, before Adam and Eve ate the apple, they didn't have that knowledge. For that reason, it seems extremely odd to me to punish Adam and Eve for their apple eating. After all, they presumably had no idea they were supposed to not do that in a moral sense. No idea that obeying God was the ethical thing to do. And looking at these two observations, I feel like we have to ask a question. If God was simply punishing Adam and Eve for disobeying him, what exactly does this myth explain? What would the point of it be? See, I'm an atheist, and when I read this text, I do so with the assumption that this was something people came up with in order to explain the world around them in some way. Primarily, this story seems to be an attempt to explain why there is suffering in the world, why life is painful and short and taxing. But if God was punishing us, even though what he said reads more like a warning than a demand, even though the people he was talking to had no understanding of morality, then he would just be a terrible, arbitrary weirdo who harmed people under unfair circumstances. And what does that tell us about why we suffer? What does it add to our understanding of the world? Nothing. It's just saying we suffer because we do, because someone randomly decided that we should. Cool. Interesting. For these reasons, I have to assume that if there's any thematic value in this story, it comes from the understanding that God did not wish us poorly when he kicked us out of Eden. That when he kicked us out, he kind of had to. And if we wanted to ask why...
Ooh, not as quite as quick on the draw with that as I wanted to be. When I think about the story of the Garden of Eden, like Big Joel from our video, I think of it as an attempt to describe something in the real world. And like Big Joel, I tend to see it more as a story of cause and effect rather than one of punishment. I imagine the story of Adam and Eve to be describing something like human morality and how the complexity in our lives increased when we reached an understanding of that framework. What I mean by that is when we think about things as being good or evil, it fundamentally changes our relationship to the world and ourselves. Canadian geese, as migratory birds, are protected animals, and this can present a problem for custodians of wetlands. Big and aggressive, truly dinosaurs alive in our time, they tend to push out all the other waterfowl in the area when they settle in to build their nests and lay eggs. The resulting lack of biodiversity can harm the whole ecosystem. If the Canadian geese were human beings, we might rightly call them settler colonialists or gentrifiers at least, but we can't, of course, because they are geese. The effect of the geese is not in question. They are, at least in some respects, harmful to their environment. But are geese good or evil creatures? I would say no. Geese are not subject to the laws or moral frameworks of man. This is what I mean when I speak of the innocence of wild things. Many of those who pay attention to nature will note that it is not very kind. It can be, in some respects, frighteningly brutal. And yet, nature gets a moral pass because it isn't subject to good and evil as concepts. When I think about the Garden of Eden, I think of it not as a place on earth, but rather as the whole earth, the things humans have set ourselves apart from by the way we conceptualize morality. Once humanity was introduced to the concepts of good and evil, or maybe more usefully, of righteousness and wrongdoing, the protections afforded to us by ignorance were lifted. Once we became capable of understanding how we harm the lives of others by pursuing our own enrichment, it could be argued that we were from then on duty bound to understand the consequences of those actions. Our ability to choose to avoid harming other creatures became our responsibility to understand that choice. It seems to me that we often long for a state of innocent ignorance, which I have started thinking of as returning to the garden. But where we have gone, there is no longer any use for innocence. It is a wishy-washy metaphysical concept, rather like good and evil, if we're being honest. We could wonder all day if such and such public figure is innocent of cosmic wrongdoing, if they are a good or evil person. I argue that such quibbling would itself be a dodge, a way to avoid having a real conversation about the effects each person has on the world around them. Humans often do harm to others, other humans, other creatures, our ecosystem. We often do harm because we are seeking to benefit ourselves. That is part of being alive. The difference between us and other creatures is that we can ostensibly choose to do better, sometimes at our own expense, sometimes greatly. We make that choice constantly, every day. To try and hide behind concepts like innocence, good or evil, is merely to try and return to the garden from whence we were banished. East of Eden, there are other ways we can think about the consequences of our actions that have more worldly bearing. We can, through painful toil and by the sweat of our brow, walk and live in our values. When we talk about goodness, we usually mean to help and not hinder the other living things around us. We usually mean to uplift the values we hold dear in the world through our actions. When we talk about evil, we usually mean to describe when we do harm to others knowingly. I can't think of much that is more painful than understanding when I have hurt someone else. In many people, the knowledge that we have done wrong can be so painful, in fact, that it registers to our brains as an attack. And we don't just feel this way about ourselves. If you've ever seen someone leap to the defense of their favorite celebrity or politician when that person is being accused of wrongdoing they have demonstrably done, you've seen this in action. We do not like knowing when we or our loved ones have hurt other people. When we hear such things, sometimes we can try to run back into the garden, back to innocence. It wasn't on purpose, we might say. We might come up with a lot of reasons why the other person who's told us they've been harmed is exaggerating, making things up. If we can just not allow ourselves to understand when we have done harm, we can pretend we are back safe in the garden. Except we cannot. For all that we deflect and deny, the truth is not metaphysical, but physical. When we do harm, the harm is done, whether or not we believe in it. The first time my husband attempted a food garden in our front yard, the tomato plants grew so tall that they shaded out the other vegetables, which all eventually failed. I would often describe them as tyrannical, though of course they could not be. They were merely growing, as plants do. They could not be faulted for the consequences of that growth, and yet the consequences remained. We are not tomato plants. We have the ability to know when our growth is shading out the others who are growing beside us. While those of us who are not Black can claim to be innocent of anti-Blackness, we still benefit greatly from the highways that cover our nation, highways that were strategically built to destroy thriving Black neighborhoods, just as a for instance, among many other examples. Those of us who are descended from settlers can claim to be innocent of colonialism, but we still have more control of the land that we live on than the living people it was stolen from. In the United States, we have been soaked from birth in white supremacist culture. It is the culture that says what is art and what is trash. It tells us what shape our body must be. It demands that the shape of our genitals must be a determining factor in every facet of our lives. It dictates that we must always be striving for some mythical normal, an icon that we hold up above everything else, a white, thin, allo-cishet, abled, neurotypical normal. Everyone who lives within these systems is harmed by them to some degree. However far we stray from the idol of normalcy dictates the shape and the magnitude of that harm. Those who are shielded from the brunt of the damage these power structures can do find it almost impossible to perceive them. This is by design. So we can try our best to be perfect, to never cause harm, to get a perfect understanding of these systems and how they are acting on us in order to counteract them. But we won't be perfect. We can't be. This is why it is so vital that we learn how to listen to criticism from the people we are shading out and believe them when they tell us what they need. If we are shading out someone else, there can be a temptation to believe it is because we chose correctly when they chose incorrectly, that we somehow earned our good fortune by being canny. This is fallacious thinking. Only listening to the criticism of those we are harming, even if it is angry criticism or imperfectly spoken, can tell us how to do rightly by them. And we must do rightly by them. Frustratingly and confusingly, people who are the perpetrators of harm in many instances use the language of victimhood themselves. At this year's General Assembly, I was dismayed by the gadflies who had seemingly endless grievance, words that boiled down to, in effect, white supremacy is metaphysically evil. I am metaphysically innocent. Therefore, the attempt to paint me or my loved ones as metaphysically evil is an attack. Other criticisms were in the formalities, in the process. It was simply nitpicking, attempts to hold off on a decisive vote against systemic white supremacy. I recognize these grievances and the place where they came from. I used to feel something like them myself. I am that most dreaded thing a millennial could be, a trust fund baby. I spent a long time deflecting into innocence, trying to run back into the garden, worrying about whether I was a good person or a bad person, and not worrying enough about how to use the power I have to undo harmful systems of oppression. To a casual observer, it can be really hard to distinguish the bad faith quibbles from the criticisms that are necessary for us to hear and integrate in order to avoid perpetuating harmful systems. It is also true that heavily marginalized people have a different relationship to criticism than those who are not so marginalized. For instance, being canceled for white cisgender people seems to include several book deals and media tours. For people of color and trans people, particularly Black women and trans women, being canceled can mean an endless campaign of social terrorism that drives a victim from public and professional life forever over the most minor infractions. The best way to determine whether or not criticism comes from a place of restorative justice, criticism to give credence to, is to consider whether it is in defense of existing structures of power or in defense of someone's rights. Critique about someone's hairstyle not being professional enough, critique about someone's body, critique about someone's mental state. These kinds of critiques give strength to the harmful power structures that run through our society. They uphold the idol of normalcy. Critiques about how critical race theory is trying to demonize white people, how the term white supremacy makes white people feel badly about themselves. These kinds of critiques are just appeals to an innocence we left behind in the garden and a way to avoid accountability and change. Then there are the other kinds of critiques. Critiques about whiteness and how white allies treat people of color. Critiques about how capitalism's endless need for growth and profit is driving global climate change, like how it incentivizes companies like Amazon to destroy brand new electronic devices made from non-renewable petroleum and rare earth elements in order to manufacture scarcity. Critiques about the police and prisons from abolitionists and prisoners, critiques about your personal heroes, about institutions you hold sacred. Critiques from the marginalized, the shaded out, screaming to taste the sunlight, to be allowed to grow. Take a breath all the way to the top of your lungs, and let it out. When you leave today, I ask that you do not worry if you are innocent. I ask that you do not worry if you are a bad person. I ask instead that the next criticism you hear from someone with less power than you have, a person of color if you are white, a younger person if you are in one of the generations that holds most of the nation's material wealth, someone homeless or impoverished if you are housed and comfortable, a trans person if you are cis, a disabled person if you are abled. I ask that you push through the urge to defend, deny, explain, or make it about your feelings at all, and simply listen. Ask how you can be their accomplice, how to work to make things right. Till in your own earth, get your hands dirty. Get deep down to the root. That is what it means to be radical. Please join us in singing hymn number 134, Our World is One World, which can be found in the gray hymnal or on your screen.
Our world is one world. What touches one affects us all. The seas that wash us round about, the clouds that cover us, the rains that fall. Our world is one world. The thoughts we think affect us all. The way we build our attitudes, with love or hate we make a bridge or wall. Our world is one world. Its ways of wealth affect us all. The way we spend, the way we share, who are the rich or poor, who stand or fall. Our world is one world, just like a ship that bears us all, where fear and greed make many holes, but where our hearts can hear a different call.
Each week, we make an offering from the bounty we are blessed to enjoy. We do this in a spirit of love and generosity, aware that we have benefited from those who have gone before, those who, in their turn, gave generously. Our offering goes to support the work of love and justice undertaken by our two communities. Today's offering for the First Unitarian Society of Westchester, the plate will be shared with the Intergroup Association of Alcoholics Anonymous of New York. For those of us at UUCHV, our plate will be shared with DRUM, Diverse Revolutionary UU Multicultural Miniseries. You can make your donation via credit card or PayPal using the links in the chat or in the order of service. Please remember to give a little extra to compensate for the 3% surcharge. Or if you prefer, you can always mail a check. The offering will now be given and gratefully received. Please join me for the dedication of the offering. The words are on the screen. May these gifts and the work of our hands and hearts give power to always stand for as a community of faith. And now we will extinguish the chalice. The words are in your order of service. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Your gifts, whatever you discover them to be, can be used to bless or curse the world. The mind's power, the strength of the hands, the reaches of the heart, the gift of speaking, listening, imagining, seeing, waiting. Any of these can serve to feed the hungry, bind up wounds, welcome a stranger, praise what is sacred, do the work of justice, or offer love. Any of these can draw down the prison door, hoard bread, abandon the poor, obscure what is holy, comply with injustice, or withhold love. You must answer this question. What will you do with your gifts? Thank you all. Bianach Leif.
Thank you all for joining us this morning. Shane, you especially, you are truly a gift to us. Thank you. Please stay, everyone. Go get your coffee and then come back. We will have our virtual coffee hour in